My father used to say that a man's word is the only thing nobody can take from him. He said it so many times when I was growing up that I stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing a clock tick in a room you've lived in for years. I heard it again, though, clear as anything. Standing in a hospital hallway in Tucson, Arizona, at 63 years old, looking through a small rectangular window at my mother, lying in a bed with a bandage wrapped around her wrist and a bruise, the color of a storm cloud, spreading up the left side of her face. That's when I understood what he meant. Because someone had tried to take everything else from her, and the only thing I had left to give was my word that it was going to stop. My mother's name is Loretta. She's 78 years old. She's 4'11", and she has survived things that would have leveled most people. She survived my father's death from a heart attack when she was 61. She survived a house fire in 2019 that took most of what she owned and left her with nothing but a plastic bin of photographs and the clothes she was wearing when she ran out. She rebuilt, slowly, quietly, without asking anyone to feel sorry for her. She moved into a small rental house on Mesquite Lane, 3 blocks from a library she walked to every Tuesday morning, because she'd read a book a week for the past 40 years, and she wasn't about to stop. She had a garden in the back that she tended every morning before the Arizona heat made it impossible. Tomatoes, peppers, 1 lemon tree that she'd been nursing from a sapling for 4 years. Every Thursday evening without fail, she drove herself to my house for dinner. She never came empty-handed. There was always something, a jar of her green salsa, a plate of the oatmeal cookies she knew my grandkids loved, sometimes just a brown paper bag with 2 pounds of tomatoes from her garden, and a handwritten note tucked inside that said something like, "Pick these this morning. Give some to the neighbors if you have too many." She was 78 years old, and she was still thinking about the neighbors. My name is Gerald Moss. I'm 63. I spent 31 years working maintenance and operations for the city of Tucson, retired 4 years ago, and now I spend most of my time doing what I should have had time to do while I was working, fixing things that need fixing, helping where I'm needed, being present. That's what I told myself, anyway. I told myself I was present. I told myself I was paying attention. And then I found out exactly how wrong I was. And I had to sit with that for a long time before I could tell anyone else this story. My son Daniel is 40. He's a good man in most of the ways that matter. He works hard. He coaches his daughter's soccer team on Saturday mornings. He calls me when something breaks in the house because he still hasn't learned to trust himself with a wrench, and I've never once made him feel bad about that. I love my son. I want you to hold on to that while I tell you the rest, because this story is not about stopping loving someone. It's about finally opening your eyes to what's standing right next to the person you love. Daniel married a woman named Pauline 6 years ago. She was charming in the way that some people are charming when they want something complete, focused, almost dazzling. She made you feel interesting just by listening to you. My mother liked her at first. Most of us did. But my mother is the kind of woman who watches quietly before she decides, and somewhere around the 2nd year of that marriage, she went quiet in a way I didn't recognize until much later as something closer to caution. The Thursday dinners were the first thing to change. Pauline started having reasons. Scheduling conflicts, a headache, plans she'd forgotten to mention. Then it was the holidays. My mother shouldn't stay so late. She had such a long drive home. Wasn't she tired? The suggestions were always delivered softly, with what sounded like concern. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to hear the shape underneath the softness. My mother never said a word to me about it. Not once. I found out later, much later, that she'd been noticing things for nearly 2 years before that Thursday night in March, when everything came apart. She'd noticed money she'd left on her own kitchen counter go missing during a visit. She'd noticed documents moved in her filing cabinet, not missing, just moved, as if someone had been through them and hadn't quite put them back the same way. She noticed. She processed it quietly, and she protected me from it because that is exactly who my mother is and has always been. She didn't want to put me in the middle of something she couldn't yet prove. I wish she had told me. I have to live with the fact that she didn't feel she could, and that I never made it clear enough that she could. That is on me. I carry that. Thursday, March 14th, 7:18 in the evening. I was in my garage, replacing the belt on my riding mower. Radio on low when my cell phone rang. The screen said Loretta. She only calls my cell when she can't reach the house line, and I'd left the house line phone inside. I answered thinking she was probably calling to tell me she wasn't coming for dinner next week, that she was fine, not to fuss. What I heard instead was something I had never heard from my mother in 63 years of knowing her voice. She was crying. Not the way people cry when they're sad. The way they cry when something has already happened, and the shock of it hasn't fully arrived yet. Gerald. Her voice was thin, barely holding. Mom. Mom. I'm here. What happened? She was here. A pause. A breath. Pauline. She came to the house. What do you mean she came to the house? Is she there now? No. She left. Gerald, she pushed me. I fell against the kitchen counter and I think something's wrong with my wrist. I can't move it right. I remember putting my hand flat on the hood of the mower to steady myself, because my legs did something I didn't expect. Did you call 911? No, I didn't want to. I didn't want to make it a bigger thing than Mom. I was already moving toward the door. Call 911 right now. I'm on my way. Do not hang up until you call them. Do you hear me? She said she heard me. The drive to Mesquite Lane is 14 minutes on a normal evening. I was there in 9. The ambulance was already in the driveway when I pulled up, lights going, 2 paramedics inside with my mother. My neighbor, Ted Garfield, who lives across from my mother and has for 15 years, who is 72 and has a bad back and still shovels her walk without being asked. Every time it rains heavy enough to matter, Ted was standing on the porch with his arms crossed and his jaw set in a way I had never seen on his face before. He saw me coming up the walk and said, quiet and controlled, "She came in the front door, Gerald. Loretta let her in because she thought it was a friendly visit. I saw her car in the driveway, and I watched from my window because something felt off to me. I saw her go in. About 12 minutes later, I heard your mother cry out." He paused. "I called 911 before I came over. Didn't know if I should go in or wait. I waited. I'm not sure I did the right thing." I told him he did. I told him I was glad he was there. I don't think he heard me, because he was already staring at the door. My mother was sitting upright on her own couch while the paramedics worked. Her left wrist was swollen and bent at an angle that made my stomach turn. The bruise on her face had already started to show. She saw me come through the door, and the first thing, she did not reach for me, not cry harder. She straightened up a little, like she was trying to look okay for me. 78 years old, sitting there with a broken wrist and a bruised face, trying to look okay for me. "I'm all right," she said. "Gerald, I'm all right." "You're not all right, Mom. I've been through worse." That's the truest and most heartbreaking thing I've ever heard her say. The paramedics transported her to Tucson Medical Center. Fractured ulna, deep bruising across her cheekbone where her face had hit the cabinet edge going down. A pulled muscle in her shoulder from how she'd tried to catch herself. The attending physician, a young woman named Dr. Serrano, who treated my mother with a gentleness I won't forget, told me that for a woman her age, this kind of fall from a push could have been significantly worse. A Pima County Sheriff's deputy named Marcus Webb met me in the waiting room. He was calm, methodical, took notes in a small pad, and when he asked me if I knew where Pauline currently was, I told him I didn't. I called Daniel from the parking lot outside the ER. He picked up on the third ring, sounding like he'd been asleep even though it was barely 8 in the evening. "Daniel." I kept my voice as flat as I could. "Your wife went to your grandmother's house tonight and put her in the hospital." Silence. "Dad, she has a fractured wrist and a bruise across her face. She's being treated right now at TMC. I need you to tell me where Pauline is." More silence. And then something worse than silence, a hesitation I recognized. The hesitation of someone who already knew something was wrong and had been deciding whether to keep looking away from it. "She came home about an hour ago," he said finally. "She said she'd stopped by to check on Grandma, and that Grandma had gotten upset and confused and that..." He stopped. "Dad, is Mom really hurt?" "Daniel, your grandmother has a broken bone in her arm. She has a bruise on her face. Deputy Webb is looking for your wife right now, and I need you to not be the person who makes this harder to resolve than it needs to be." Do you understand me?" He understood me. Pauline turned herself in at the Pima County Sheriff's substation on Wilmot Road at 10:43 that night. She walked in on her own, according to Deputy Webb, and told the intake officer that my mother had become agitated and confused during the visit, that Loretta had tried to strike her, and that any injuries my mother sustained were the result of Pauline trying to protect herself. She said this calmly, professionally, the way you'd present a report to a board of directors. They called me just before midnight. I drove to the substation. Deputy Webb met me at the front and walked me to a small room where he sat me down and put a photograph on the table in front of me. It was a photograph of documents, my mother's documents, photographed, apparently, on a cell phone, the kind of photograph you take when you want a record of something without taking the original. Her deed, her bank account information, the paperwork for a small savings bond my father had taken out in her name 30 years ago that she'd never cashed because she said it felt like spending part of him. "We found these images on your daughter-in-law's phone," Deputy Webb told me. "She hadn't deleted them. She had them organized in a folder." He paused. "This wasn't the first time she'd been to your mother's house without your son's knowledge, Mr. Moss. We've been talking to your mother tonight. She's been cooperative. She told us about 3 other visits over the past 18 months. She never reported them." I sat with that for a long moment. "She was protecting Daniel," I said. "That's what she told us," he said. "There's a particular kind of anger that doesn't feel like fire. It feels like cold, like a temperature drop in a room that had been warm. I felt it sitting in that chair, looking at photographs of my mother's private financial documents organized in a folder on my daughter-in-law's phone. 18 months. My mother had been quietly managing this for 18 months, noticing the missing money, the moved files, the visits that felt wrong, and she had said nothing because she did not want Daniel to have to choose. I drove back to the hospital. My mother was awake, wrist in a temporary cast, watching a nature program on the small television mounted in the corner of the room with the sound turned down. She looked at me when I came in and she said, "How bad is it going to be for Daniel?" That's the question she asked. Not, "Is she going to jail?" Not, "What happens to me?" How bad is it going to be for Daniel? I sat down next to her bed, and I took her good hand in both of mine, and I said, "Daniel is going to be okay, Mom, and you are going to be okay. And I am going to make absolutely sure of both of those things." She nodded once, slowly. Then she looked back at the television. After a minute, she said, almost to herself, "I kept thinking, maybe I was reading it wrong. Maybe I was being an old woman who sees trouble where there isn't any." She paused. "I wasn't reading it wrong, was I? It wasn't really a question." "No," I said, "you weren't." What unfolded over the following weeks came in pieces, the way truth usually does when you've been avoiding looking directly at it for a long time. My mother's attorney, a woman named Patricia Howe, who my mother had used for years and trusted completely, went through Loretta's financial records with a level of care that revealed things I hadn't known to look for. Over a period of 14 months, small amounts had been moved from my mother's checking account, never enough to trigger an automatic alert. But across 14 months, it added up to just over $11,000. The savings bond had been researched. Pauline had contacted the issuing institution using my mother's name and date of birth, requesting information about redemption. She hadn't completed the redemption. My mother's signature would have been required in person, but she had gathered everything she needed to understand the bond's current value. What she had been building, slowly, over nearly 2 years, was a picture of my mother's assets, a complete picture. And then something had gone wrong with her timeline. My mother had mentioned to Daniel, casually, that she was thinking of updating her will and adding a specific provision for her great-grandchildren. A small thing, a grandmother's thought. But to someone who had been quietly mapping the territory, it must have sounded like a door closing. That conversation happened 11 days before March 14th. Pauline was charged with elder abuse, elder financial exploitation, and second-degree assault on a person over 65. In Arizona, assault on a person over 65 is a Class 3 felony. She did not get probation. She was sentenced to 14 months in state prison, and 3 years of supervised probation upon release, with a permanent protective order, keeping her away from my mother, my son's home, and any financial institution my mother uses. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Sandra Birch, addressed Pauline directly at sentencing and said something I will paraphrase here because her exact words are not mine to reproduce, but the meaning was this: that the deliberate, patient targeting of an elderly woman by someone she had trusted as family was among the most cynical betrayals a court could be asked to consider, and that the sentence reflected that. I want to be honest with you about Daniel, because you deserve the full picture, and so does he. He did not know the extent of what was happening. I believe that. What he knew or allowed himself not to fully examine was that his wife and his grandmother had a friction between them, and that it was easier to manage by keeping them apart than by asking the harder questions. He chose comfort over clarity for long enough that comfort became complicity, even if it was unconscious. He has had to live with that. He is living with it now. He filed for divorce 9 days after Pauline's arrest. It has not been easy for him. I don't expect it to be easy. I'm not going to tell you he handled everything right, because he didn't, and he knows that better than anyone. What I will tell you is that he was at my mother's house the Sunday after she was discharged, sitting at her kitchen table while she showed him how to make her green salsa from scratch, because she said she'd been meaning to teach him for years and she wasn't going to keep putting it off. He cried somewhere around the point where she handed him the wooden spoon and told him to stir. She pretended not to notice. That's who she is. There are people in this story I want to name before I finish, because they deserve to be named. Patricia Howe, my mother's attorney, who spent more hours on this case than she billed, and never once made my mother feel like a victim instead of a client. Deputy Marcus Webb, who never let my mother's age make him assume she was confused or unreliable, and who followed every thread of the financial investigation without being asked to. And Ted Garfield, who has a bad back and 15 years of watching out for my mother from across the street, who called 911 before he even came over, because he wanted help there as fast as possible and didn't let his own uncertainty slow him down. After everything was resolved after the sentencing, after Daniel's divorce was filed, after I sat with my own attorney and helped my mother update every document that needed updating, including a trust that now has both Patricia Howe and Ted Garfield listed as secondary trustees. In the event something happens to me, I did one more thing. I drove to my mother's house on a regular Thursday evening. Not a special occasion, not an event. A Thursday. She had dinner on the stove. She had not called first, because she said she figured I was coming and she wasn't going to fuss about it. The lemon tree in the back had finally produced its first real fruit, 4 lemons, and she was inexplicably proud of all 4 of them, as if each one were a personal accomplishment. The doctor says my wrist is healing right on schedule, she said, not looking up from the stove. Maybe a little ahead of schedule, actually. He seemed surprised. I wasn't. You weren't? I've been tending that lemon tree for 4 years, she said. I'm not going to let a broken wrist stop me from seeing it through. I stood in her kitchen doorway for a moment, watching her stir something that smelled like the entire history of my childhood, and I thought about my father's saying, about a man's word being the only thing nobody can take from him. I thought about how my mother had been protecting hers, her word, her dignity, her sense of herself as a woman who sees trouble clearly even when everyone around her is looking away for 18 months, quietly, without recognition, without anyone even knowing she was doing it. Nobody was going to take that from her, not in my presence, not ever again. I'm not going to tell you I feel triumphant about how this ended, friends. Triumph isn't the right word for a story where your 78-year-old mother has to hold herself together in a hospital bed and ask if her grandson is going to be okay before she asks a single thing about herself. What I feel is something steadier than triumph, something that doesn't go away when the moment passes. I feel awake, and I will tell you, as plainly as I can, that it took me too long to get there. If you're watching tonight and you have a parent who has gone quiet in a way that you've been telling yourself is just age or stubbornness, or not wanting to make a fuss, I want you to hear me. The quiet ones are not managing. They are protecting you. Go to them before they have to call you from a kitchen floor. Ask the question you've been putting off. Sit at the table until they tell you what they've actually been carrying. I drive over to Mesquite Lane every Thursday evening now. I don't call first. She never called first either, and I finally understand why. The door's always open.